Rebuilding after 50, the Buddhist path to renewal. The idea that life after 50 is a slow retreat is one of the most persistent lies the mind tells itself. It is repeated so often that it begins to feel like wisdom, when in fact it is only a fear story dressed in common sense. The story says that vitality belongs to the young, relevance belongs to the fast, and value belongs to those who still resemble the versions of themselves they used to be. It says that once certain years are behind you, the best of life has already passed, and what remains is only a gradual thinning out of strength, influence, and possibility. Buddhism sees through that story immediately. It does not deny change, and it does not romanticize age, but it refuses the idea that decline is the true meaning of it. What people call decline is often only resistance. The real suffering does not come from hair turning gray, bodies slowing down, or roles changing shape. It comes from the inner demand that none of this should be happening. That demand is the hidden source of pain. It is the mind standing against the river of impermanence, and then blaming the river for being wet. At 50, many people do not suffer because they are aging. They suffer because they are trying to preserve a version of themselves that no longer exists. They are still thinking of themselves as if they should be able to move through life with the same speed, the same social power, the same appearance, the same energy, and the same certainty they once had. But that self is already gone. What remains is not a failure. It is a different stage of life asking for a different kind of intelligence. The first task of rebuilding is therefore not addition but release. You have to let go of the fantasy that the past can be restored in its original shape. The old framework of identity must be seen clearly enough to stop governing the present. The person you were at 30 was not a permanent essence. They were a temporary expression of conditions that have now changed. If you keep trying to repeat that older life, you will only exhaust yourself with imitation. Buddhism offers a radical correction here. It says that the self is not a fixed object waiting to be protected from change. It is a process, a flow, a continual becoming. Suffering begins when the mind tries to freeze that flow into an image and then demands that life obey the image. That is why so much of midlife pain feels like grief mixed with frustration. The mind is not merely noticing change. It is resisting change while calling that resistance dignity. But there is dignity in something else. Adaptation without self-betrayal. There is dignity in seeing clearly that the old form of life has ended, and that the next one must be built from different materials. This does not mean becoming smaller, it means becoming truer. If youth once gave speed, then maturity can give discernment. If youth once gave visibility, then maturity can give depth. If youth once rewarded expansion, then maturity may reward refinement. The task is not to become younger. The task is to become fully inhabitable at the age you actually are. This is why the metaphor of destruction is necessary. To rebuild after 50, one must first destroy the expectation that life should still behave like it did before. One must destroy the belief that worth depends on preserving the same body, the same energy, the same status, or the same social attention. These are not the foundations of a meaningful life. They are conditions that come and go. When the mind stops treating them as permanent, it becomes possible to build something more stable. That rebuilding begins with truth, and truth at this stage of life is often less flattering than it is freeing. The crisis that often arrives in midlife is quiet. It does not always look dramatic from the outside. A person may continue working, supporting family, maintaining obligations, and appearing composed while internally feeling strangely unmoored. The issue is not always a visible collapse. More often, it is a subtle loss of confidence in the identity that once seemed obvious. The titles still exist, but they do not feel as solid. The roles remain, but they no longer fully contain the person. The body changes, the social world changes, and the self that once seemed fixed begins to reveal its instability. This can feel like erasure, but Buddhism would call it revelation. The belief in a permanent, unchanging self is one of the central misunderstandings that keeps suffering alive. What you have called me has always been a moving arrangement of habits, memories, fears, desires, and social reflections. It has never been as solid as it felt. Midlife exposes this because the usual supports begin to shift. You are no longer the youngest person in the room. You are no longer automatically rewarded for speed. You may no longer be defined by the roles that once gave your life a clean shape. The old architecture of identity starts to loosen. Many people panic at this point because they interpret loosening as loss. But loosening can also be freedom. If the old identity was built out of masks, then losing the mask is not the loss of the self. It is the beginning of honesty. The person may feel exposed, but exposure is not always harm. Sometimes exposure is what allows something real to emerge. This is where rebuilding becomes alchemical. The old self, with all of its familiar validations, cannot simply be repaired and returned to service. Trying to do that usually produces imitation rather than renewal. People reach for the past and try to reproduce it in smaller, weaker form. They want the same confidence without the same conditions, the same influence without the same body, the same desire without the same context. But that is not rebuilding. That is nostalgia in disguise. Real rebuilding requires that the old image be allowed to die. This is not a morbid death. It is the death of the belief that identity must remain fixed. If the old self was organized around physical power, then the new self may need to be organized around wisdom. If the old self was built around public recognition, then the new self may need to be built around private steadiness. If the old self depended on being needed, then the new self may need to rest in being clear. These are not losses in the absolute sense. They are transformations of value. This is why age can become a form of refinement. What is unnecessary falls away. What is performative becomes harder to sustain. What is truly durable begins to matter more. The person slowly learns that they do not need to become a replica of their younger self in order to remain meaningful. They only need to become more truthful about what actually remains when the masks are no longer useful. That truth can feel frightening because the ego does not like being stripped of its familiar decorations. But the stripping itself is a kind of mercy. It reveals what is real beneath the accumulated performances. And what is real can be built upon. What is false cannot. If the first part of rebuilding is release, the second is discipline. At 50, waiting for inspiration becomes an increasingly unreliable strategy. The mind may still imagine that a sudden surge of motivation will arrive and carry everything forward, but life rarely works that way. Motivation is unstable. It rises and falls with sleep, mood, weather, stress, and circumstance. If you depend on motivation to rebuild your life, you are depending on something too changeable to be trusted. Buddhism takes a different view. It does not ask whether you feel ready. It asks whether you will act wisely anyway. That shift is crucial because it moves the basis of change away from emotion and toward structure. A person in the second half of life cannot afford to treat discipline as optional. Discipline is what keeps the mind from being ruled by every fluctuation in feeling. It is what allows the body to strengthen, the mind to clear, the finances to stabilize, and the day to develop a shape that does not collapse whenever mood becomes inconvenient. This is why monastic rhythm is such a useful model. The monk does not meditate because he feels particularly spiritual every morning. He meditates because the structure of the life calls for it. The form carries him when the spirit is tired. That is not a punishment, it is an intelligent arrangement. In the same way, rebuilding after 50 requires rhythms that do not depend on enthusiasm. It requires daily practices that continue whether or not the inner climate is favorable. A life that rebuilds itself through structure is less glamorous than a life driven by bursts of passion. But it is far more durable. Small acts repeated over time create the conditions for real change. Reading with focus, moving the body with care, sleeping with consistency, guarding attention, reducing unnecessary noise, handling money with discipline. These acts may appear modest, but they are the hidden architecture of a strong second half of life. What matters is not dramatic transformation. What matters is steady reconstruction. The unseen hours matter most because that is where identity is reformed. No one may witness the early morning stretch, the quiet refusal to indulge distraction, the careful reorganization of the day, the sober decision to stop wasting energy on what drains you. But those unseen decisions are what build the next version of life. Discipline, in this sense, is not harshness. It is care that has become practical. It is the willingness to create conditions in which the best part of you can continue to exist without being dependent on feeling inspired. That is where rebuilding becomes real. The mind at midlife often resists this process because it wants the rebuilt life to feel like a return to earlier intensity. It wants the excitement of youth without the chaos of youth, the confidence of youth without the uncertainty of youth, the speed of youth without the cost of youth. But this is impossible. The second half of life is not meant to be a copy of the first. It is meant to be more honest, more selective, and often more quiet. This is where the anatomy of resistance becomes important. Resistance does not always appear as open refusal. Sometimes it looks like procrastination. Sometimes it looks like cynical humor. Sometimes it looks like endless analysis. Sometimes it looks like nostalgia, where the mind keeps glorifying a past identity rather than facing the present one. Resistance is anything in the psyche that keeps saying, in effect, I do not want this stage to be real. The problem is that resisting reality does not stop reality. It only adds friction. That friction becomes fatigue, and fatigue becomes discouragement. The person then misreads their exhaustion as proof that rebuilding is impossible, when in fact the exhaustion often came from fighting the truth instead of working with it. Buddhism offers a severe but liberating correction. Stop arguing with impermanence. The body is changing. The social role is changing. The emotional landscape is changing. The life you had is not the life you are in now. That is not a catastrophe. It's simply the terrain. Once the person stops spending so much energy pretending that the terrain should be otherwise, they recover energy for what can actually be built. This is where the old self must be allowed to loosen further. Not because it was evil, but because it was temporary. The identity built on speed, visibility, comparison, and youthful force cannot be carried forever. It will break under its own weight if the person insists on preserving it. But when the person sees that the identity was always an arrangement rather than an essence, they can begin to create from a more stable center. That center is not loud. It is not based on proving anything. It is based on seeing clearly what the current stage of life requires. Strategic patience may matter more than speed. Depth may matter more than display. Inner steadiness may matter more than being admired. These are not compromises. They are upgrades in the quality of life. Rebuilding after 50 begins when the person stops treating age as a sentence and starts treating it as a new curriculum. That shift changes everything. The moment age is seen as a curriculum rather than a verdict, resistance begins to change shape. It no longer looks like a wall. It looks more like a habit of mind that can be examined, understood, and eventually weakened. This matters because much of the pain of rebuilding after 50 comes from hidden resistance, not visible obstacles. People often think they are being realistic when they are actually being loyal to an old identity that no longer fits. They call it caution, but it is often fear. They call it wisdom, but it is often attachment to the familiar. The first hidden resistance is the insistence that life should still reward the old methods. It should still respond to speed, force, ambition, or sheer effort in the same way it once did. But midlife exposes the limits of that approach. What worked before may now create strain instead of progress. The body may require more care. The mind may require more silence. The social world may require less performance and more discernment. To ignore these changes is to continue pushing with outdated tools. Buddhism does not ask for surrender in the weak sense. It asks for contact with reality. That means seeing where energy is being wasted on denial. It means recognizing that a large part of suffering comes from trying to make the present behave like the past. The person may continue to imagine that if they just work harder, the old certainty will return. But the deeper wisdom is to understand that what must be built now is not a recovery of youth, but a different form of strength altogether. This is where the hidden work begins. The work no one applauds. The work that does not look impressive. The work of simplifying the day. The work of protecting the mind from noise. The work of moving the body with respect rather than with punishment. The work of saying no to what drains attention. The work of letting certain expectations die quietly, rather than feeding them with endless mental repetition. The person who rebuilds well after 50 becomes less interested in being dramatic about change and more interested in being exact about it. They learn that not everything deserves equal energy. They learn that many forms of resistance are only forms of loyalty to exhaustion. They learn that rebuilding is less about force and more about alignment. Once the mind stops resisting the current stage of life, a great deal of energy returns. That returned energy can then be invested in the actual task of becoming clear. Resistance often hides itself behind narratives that seem reasonable. A person says they are too old to start, too late to change, too burdened to begin again. These statements can feel factual, but they are often emotional protections designed to prevent disappointment. The mind would rather declare a path impossible than risk failing at it, so it shrinks the future before the future can test it. This is one of the most common ways suffering maintains itself. The person does not merely resist action, they resist the possibility of a different self. They remain emotionally loyal to the image of who they used to be because that image feels known. Even if it is no longer useful, it is familiar, and familiarity is one of the deepest forces in the psyche. Buddhism teaches that this kind of attachment is a source of friction. The mind clings to a static self-image, and then suffers when life demands movement. But there is no permanent self to preserve. There is only a stream of changing conditions, changing capacities, and changing responsibilities. Once this is seen clearly, the question becomes less, how do I keep being who I was, and more, what does this stage require? That question is more honest and more fruitful. Resistance also appears in subtler forms. Sometimes it is not a refusal to begin, but a refusal to simplify. The person keeps too many obligations, too many distractions, too many emotional entanglements, and too much digital noise because all of it helps preserve the illusion that they are still living at full speed. But that fullness often hides fragmentation. The life is crowded, yet not directed, busy, yet not coherent, full of activity, yet strangely thin in meaning. The anatomy of resistance reveals that the mind often protects itself by preserving what is familiar, even when it is no longer nourishing. A person may resist change not because they love their current life, but because they fear the emptiness that might appear if the old structures were removed. That fear is understandable, but it is not a sufficient reason to remain trapped in what drains you. The answer is not to force change violently. It is to see resistance clearly enough that it loses some of its mystique. When the mind recognizes that much of its refusal is just fear wearing the clothes of reason, the grip begins to loosen. Then the work can begin honestly, without denial and without theatrics. That is why rebuilding starts with clarity, not inspiration, not ambition. Clarity, the willingness to see the actual shape of your resistance, is the first real act of renewal. Once resistance is seen clearly, the ego begins to lose some of its authority over identity. This is the stage where many people feel a subtle grief. They realize that the mask they wore so effectively for years is no longer sufficient. The title, the competence, the attractiveness, the speed, the role, all of these may still exist in some form, but they no longer provide the same sense of solidity. The old social self starts to feel thinner, and that thinning can feel like humiliation if the person mistakes it for disappearance. But Buddhism offers a different interpretation. The thinning of the mask is not a reduction of being. It is the loosening of illusion. The ego is built on continuity of image. It wants to be recognized as the same thing over time. It wants a clear story. It wants to know how to introduce itself. It wants to preserve a familiar shape. But real life does not cooperate with that demand. The body changes, the social landscape changes, and the inner life changes too. What survives is not the image, but the capacity to see, choose, and respond. That capacity is more valuable than the role ever was. This is why identity loss can become alchemy. When the old roles no longer hold the self together, the person has a chance to discover what was never dependent on them. A quieter intelligence emerges, a more stable presence, a kind of inward authority that does not need to be loud to be real. The person begins to see that they are not their past success, not their public image, not their former momentum. They are the awareness in which all of those things arose and passed. That realization can be frightening because the ego interprets it as death. In a sense, it is death, but only the death of what was never essential. What dies is the need to be a fixed and admired version of oneself. What remains is something more flexible and more honest. A process, a stream, a living adjustment to reality. The mistake many people make is trying to rebuild by reproducing the old self in reduced form. They want to keep the same identity, but with fewer resources. They want to replay old successes in a new body. with new responsibilities, under changed conditions. But that usually fails because the old blueprint no longer fits the land. You cannot rebuild the future by worshiping the past. The wiser path is to let the old framework soften so that a new one can emerge. This is not a betrayal of who you were. It is a recognition that who you were was always temporary. There is no shame in changing form. The shame lies only in refusing to change when change is the only honest response. This is the alchemy of midlife, turning loss of image into gain of depth. The deeper a person moves into this process, the clearer it becomes that discipline matters more than inspiration. The ego loves inspiration because inspiration feels like momentum without effort. It gives the mind a surge of energy and a sense that change is happening naturally. But inspiration is unstable. It fades. It depends on mood, novelty, and circumstance. A person rebuilding after 50 cannot afford to depend on something so volatile. Discipline is different. Discipline is not emotional. It is structural. It is the decision to keep showing up in ways that support the life you are actually trying to build. Not the life you wish you still had. Not the life that would impress others. The life that can be sustained now. This may mean more regular sleep, fewer distractions, more deliberate movement, quieter mornings, simpler commitments, and more consistent attention to what the body and mind genuinely require. Buddhism values this kind of repetition because it understands that transformation happens through practice, not wishful thinking. The monastery is not built on mood, it is built on rhythm. The practitioner meditates because the practice is part of the life, not because they feel especially deserving of peace on any given day. That same monastic logic is useful in the second half of life. The work must be integrated into the structure of the day, or it will be left at the mercy of mood. This does not mean life becomes harsh. On the contrary, it often becomes kinder because it becomes more stable. The person is no longer asking their emotions to carry the burden of change. They are creating conditions in which change can actually occur. This is a quieter form of responsibility, but it is much more effective. A few disciplined acts repeated over months will do more for rebuilding than 1,000 dramatic intentions. The unseen hours matter most. The early walk, the quiet reading, the intentional meal, the reduced clutter, the disciplined financial decision, the phone left untouched for a while, the refusal to fill every silence, the willingness to repeat a useful act even when it feels small. These are the places where a new life slowly forms. The ego may complain that this is too ordinary, too slow, too invisible, but ordinary and invisible are often exactly what is needed. The person is not building a performance. They are building a life, and lives are not repaired by display. They are repaired by structure. This is why discipline becomes a form of compassion. It protects the future self from the chaos of the present. It creates a container sturdy enough for the next chapter to grow. As discipline grows, the person begins to notice another hidden cost of the old way of living: energy leakage. Much of what people call fatigue in midlife is not simply age. It is the result of scattered attention, unexamined obligations, emotional overinvestment, and constant low-grade resistance. The mind spends itself in places that do not repay the cost. It revisits old stories, manages unnecessary drama, and carries more social weight than it needs to. By the end of the day, there is a feeling of being drained that has less to do with age than with diffusion. The economics of energy are simple, though not always easy to honor. Whatever you keep feeding grows stronger. Whatever drains you without replenishment should be examined. Not every obligation is worth preserving in its current form. Not every relationship deserves the same access. Not every habit deserves to remain. Rebuilding after 50 requires an audit of where your life force is going, and whether those expenditures are actually meaningful. Buddhism would say that suffering often continues because attention and energy are repeatedly invested in the wrong objects. The mind clings to what is familiar, even when familiar has become expensive. It continues to worry about things that cannot be controlled. It continues to compare, to self-correct, to self-criticize, to over-explain, to overwork, to over-consume. Each of these behaviors steals a little from the deeper reconstruction that could be underway. The question is not whether effort is being made. The question is whether the effort is coherent. Many people are exhausted not because they are lazy, but because they are trying to maintain too many unnecessary fronts at once. Social obligations, digital distraction, emotional caretaking, professional performance, internal self-judgment, all of it competes for the same finite reservoir. If the reservoir is not protected, rebuilding becomes impossible. This is where simplicity becomes strategic rather than aesthetic. A simpler life is not a lesser one. It is a more usable one. It preserves energy for what actually matters. It reduces the friction caused by clutter, noise, and surplus obligation. It allows the person to direct their strength toward what will genuinely sustain them. That may mean fewer commitments, fewer comparisons, fewer possessions, fewer social performances, and fewer demands on the nervous system. Energy is not infinite. The second half of life reveals that truth with increasing clarity. Rebuilding requires treating it with respect. It asks, in effect, what is consuming your life force, and is it worth the cost? That question, answered honestly, becomes the beginning of real recovery. Once the economics of energy are understood, simplicity stops being a style and becomes a method. The mind can only rebuild when it is not constantly burdened by excess. Excess stuff, excess obligation, excess noise, excess comparison, excess social performance. Excess digital intake, all of it fragments attention and weakens the ability to sustain change. Simplicity, by contrast, creates room. It is the room in which clarity can actually breathe. This applies not only to the physical environment, but to the emotional and social environment as well. A cluttered life often keeps the person mentally preoccupied with maintenance. A crowded schedule keeps the mind reactive. A noisy digital life keeps the nervous system in permanent partial alert. A social world built on obligation rather than mutuality keeps the person drained. Rebuilding after 50 requires fewer of these frictions, not more. Buddhism points toward this without sentimentality. It does not suggest that one should become a minimalist for the sake of looking pure or enlightened. It suggests that unnecessary complexity is a burden, when the real task is inner liberation. Simplicity is useful because it removes distractions that keep the mind from settling. It makes discipline easier to sustain because there is less to manage. It makes awareness easier to maintain because there is less clutter competing for attention. This is especially important in the second half of life because the person is no longer being asked to build through sheer expansion. The task is refinement. Refinement requires subtraction. The mind must learn what to leave alone, what not to carry, what not to revisit, what not to store, what not to keep defending. This is not a loss of richness. It is the removal of what never truly supported richness in the first place. A simpler environment often reveals that much of the old urgency was manufactured by excess. Too many choices, too many inputs, too many expectations, too many hidden commitments to outdated forms of identity. Once the excess begins to fall away, the mind can see what is still alive. Often what remains is enough space, enough strength, enough direction, enough truth to build on. This is why simplicity is not merely a practical tactic. It is a spiritual discipline. It clears the field. It makes the next steps visible. It allows the person to live with less waste and more intentionality. That matters because the second act of life is not won by accumulating more. It is won by directing what you already have with greater precision if you want. I can continue with the next part and keep the same style until the full rewritten essay is complete. Simplicity is not only about removing clutter from the room or reducing the number of commitments on the calendar. It is also about removing the excess material the mind keeps carrying long after it has stopped being useful. People enter midlife with old stories still running in the background. Stories about who they should have become, what they should have achieved, what others think of them, and what their life was supposed to look like by now. These stories consume attention as surely as physical clutter consumes space. The problem is that mental clutter is harder to notice because it often sounds like reflection, but reflection clarifies while clutter repeats. Reflection asks useful questions. Clutter loops. It revisits old disappointments, old comparisons, old fantasies of a different life, old grievances about how things turned out. Each revisit steals energy from the present. Each revisit reinforces the sense that peace is elsewhere, later, or dependent on some correction in the world. Buddhism asks the mind to stop feeding this inner noise, not by denying the past, but by refusing to let the past occupy more space than it deserves. Once the unnecessary mental load begins to fall away, the person discovers that a large part of exhaustion was self-generated. The mind was overstuffed with obligations it had no reason to keep honoring. The life looked heavy because the inner room was crowded. That is why simplicity becomes one of the most practical forms of wisdom in the second half of life. It gives back usable energy. It reduces friction. It clears the path for a life that can actually be lived rather than constantly managed. The person no longer spends so much strength on appearances, obligations, and reactions. They have room to notice what is essential, and when the essential becomes visible, purpose can begin to take shape again. Purpose after 50 is often misunderstood as a second act of reinvention, as though the person must discover some grand new identity in order to feel complete. But purpose does not have to be dramatic to be real. In fact, the most stable purpose at this stage often grows out of wisdom rather than ambition. It is less about proving something to the world and more about contributing from the depth of what has been lived. This is a profound shift. The younger self often seeks purpose through expansion. More influence, more visibility, more status, more achievement. The mature self can begin to seek purpose through alignment. What is true, what is useful, what is needed, what can be offered without self-destruction. That difference matters because it changes the emotional tone of the life. Purpose becomes less anxious and more grounded. Buddhism helps here because it strips away the illusion that meaning must come from external validation. A purposeful life is not one that is loudly admired. It is one that is coherent. The person knows what matters and organizes life around that knowing. This may include teaching, mentoring, building, caring, creating, serving, or simply living with enough clarity that others are steadied by the example. The form matters less than the integrity beneath it. Choosing a second-act purpose requires honesty about what has actually matured in you, not what once made you impressive, but what now makes you useful. Maybe your strength is patience. Maybe it is discernment. Maybe it is the ability to guide without controlling, or to create without needing applause, or to remain calm where others panic. These qualities often emerge more fully later in life, once the louder ambitions have quieted down. Purpose also becomes more sustainable when it is detached from external approval. If you need everyone to understand or admire your new direction, you will once again be giving away authority. The wiser route is to choose a purpose that feels internally true even if it remains largely unseen. That kind of purpose can carry a life because it is not built on performance. It is built on conviction. This is the key. The second act is not a theatrical reinvention. It is a deliberate alignment of attention, energy, and action with what is now genuinely worth living for. When purpose is chosen from wisdom instead of ego, the person begins to feel a different kind of strength. It is not the strength of speed or visibility. It is the strength of coherence. The various parts of life begin to point in the same direction. How time is spent, how energy is used, how relationships are held, how money is managed, how the body is cared for, and how the mind is protected. This coherence is what makes a second-act purpose durable. One of the great mistakes people make at midlife is assuming that purpose must be found through novelty alone. They think a new project, a new career, or a new identity will automatically revive meaning. Sometimes change is necessary, but novelty by itself is not enough. If the inner patterns remain the same: comparison, approval seeking, fragmentation, and resistance, then the new life will eventually reproduce the old suffering in a different form. What must change first is not the label, but the way the self relates to it. Buddhism would call this a change in relationship to self and world. Purpose becomes trustworthy when it is no longer used as a disguise for insecurity. If I work, create, or serve in order to be admired, then my purpose is still owned by ego. If I do it because it is coherent with the life I now understand, then it becomes much freer. It is no longer a bid for identity. It is a continuation of insight. This is why the mature purpose often feels quieter. It may be less glamorous and less externally legible, but it is more deeply satisfying because it is not constantly asking to be validated. The person knows why they are doing what they are doing. That knowledge can sustain them in a way that applause cannot. It becomes possible to commit without needing the world to mirror that commitment back. A purpose of this kind also changes the way one relates to success. Success is no longer just the accumulation of visible markers. It becomes the degree to which life is being lived in alignment with what is true. That might mean protecting one's health. It might mean refining a craft. It might mean becoming more available to family or community. It might mean reducing distraction so that the mind can remain clear enough to be of service. The outer form may differ greatly from one person to another, but the inner question remains the same. What is worthy of my remaining life? That question carries weight because time is no longer imagined as endlessly abundant. The second half of life makes the limits visible, but those limits can become a blessing. They clarify what matters. They remove the illusion that everything can be pursued. They force the person to choose, and choice creates shape. A shapeless life is often an overloaded one. A purposeful life is a selected one. This selection is what gives the later years their dignity. The dignity of the later years depends largely on whether the person can make peace with what has ended, without converting that ending into bitterness. This is where the mastery of peace begins. Peace is not passive acceptance in the weak sense of resignation. It is the strong capacity to remain unshaken even while life changes in ways one did not choose. It is the refusal to let loss determine the whole quality of the inner world. Buddhism points directly to this kind of peace because it understands that suffering deepens when the mind demands that life should not change. But life does change. Bodies change, roles change, families change, economies change, social visibility changes, energy changes, and eventually the person changes in ways that cannot be reversed. If peace depends on resisting all of that, then peace will never remain stable for long. The mastery of peace begins when the person stops asking the world to be fixed before they can be calm. That demand is what keeps the heart clenched. It creates a subtle war between the mind and reality. But once the war is seen as unnecessary, the mind can soften without collapsing. It can accept change without calling that acceptance defeat. This is not the same as saying everything is good. It is saying that suffering becomes optional, where resistance is no longer feeding it. That is a hard lesson, but a liberating one, because once the person stops demanding a different reality in order to relax, they can begin to relax now. Not perfectly, not forever, but genuinely. Peace then becomes less a reward for favorable circumstances and more a skill of non-resistance. A trained mind can remain steady through fluctuation. It can carry disappointment without becoming broken by it. It can honor the past without living inside it. This peace is not produced by hiding from life. It comes from being able to face life without panic. The person can see what has passed, what has changed, and what remains. They can grieve without hopelessness. They can adjust without self-contempt. They can move forward without pretending that forward means recapturing what is gone. The result is a quiet kind of freedom, one that becomes more valuable with age because it is no longer dependent on youth, applause, or permanence. The mastery of peace, then, is not the fantasy of never being touched by difficulty. It is the capacity to remain unshaken at the center while life continues to move. That center does not require perfection. It requires presence, and presence, in the end, is the most reliable home the mind can have. Presence becomes the final and most practical reward of all the earlier work. When the mind has been stripped of excess, when resistance has softened, when ego has lost some of its grip, when attention has returned to itself, and when purpose has been chosen from wisdom rather than vanity, the person begins to inhabit life more fully, not more dramatically. More fully, there is less mental spillage, less frantic comparison, less need to narrate oneself, less need to ask permission, less need to prove that one is still alive. This is important because many people in midlife unconsciously live as if they are still auditioning for significance. They keep striving to be noticed, to be admired, to be chosen, to be relevant, but significance does not have to be performed. It can be lived. A quiet, coherent, disciplined life often carries more weight than a louder one because it is not fragmented by self-display. Buddhism points toward this quiet authority again and again. The person who is not constantly defending an image becomes more available to truth. They can hear the actual needs of their body. They can sense the actual condition of their mind. They can see which relationships nourish and which ones drain. They can move with greater precision because they are not hiding from reality behind performance. At this stage, life is not about becoming someone new in the theatrical sense. It is about becoming less divided. The mature self is not built from loud reinvention, but from coherence. The person begins to discover that what they can offer now is often more valuable than what they once could offer, even if it appears less flashy. Wisdom, steadiness, patience, discernment, and unforced presence often matter more in the second half of life than raw speed ever did. This is the deeper meaning of rebuilding, not recovering the old self, not denying change, not racing against age, but shaping a life that can hold the truth of the present without resentment. The old story of decline loses power when the person sees that value has changed form rather than disappeared. The river has not ended. It has simply moved into a different shape. That is why the mastery of peace matters. It keeps the person from mistaking change for loss of worth. It allows them to live without clinging to earlier forms. It gives them the strength to continue without needing the past to return. And that is perhaps the most mature freedom of all, the ability to stand in the present without asking it to resemble an earlier chapter. The second half of life, then, is not a diminished life, it is a distilled one. It asks for less performance and more truth, less speed and more discernment, less noise and more coherence. And if the person can meet that demand, what emerges is not decline but a quieter kind of power. The quiet power of the second half of life is easy to miss because it does not announce itself with the kind of energy people usually admire. It is not the power of speed, conquest, or visibility. It is the power of no longer needing to be carried by illusions. A person who has rebuilt honestly after 50 often appears calmer, but that calm is not passivity. It is the result of no longer wasting life force on arguments with reality. This is why the mastery of peace matters so much. It protects the person from the false idea that success must look like the old story of ascent. Real success after 50 may look like fewer distractions, fewer obligations, fewer performances, and fewer unnecessary struggles. It may look like a smaller but more coherent life. It may look like a life in which the body is respected, the mind is guarded, and the day is shaped by what actually sustains rather than what merely impresses. A life like that is not a retreat from greatness. It is a retreat from noise. Buddhism would say that suffering decreases when the mind stops demanding that reality validate the ego's preferred image. At midlife, this insight becomes especially practical. You no longer have the luxury of living as if time were endless and energy infinite. The life that remains must be used well. That means choosing what is worthy, releasing what is wasteful, and refusing to keep feeding old narratives of decline or comparison. Those narratives are not truth, they are habits. The person who sees this can begin to live with a more exacting kind of kindness toward themselves. Not indulgence, not self-punishment, kindness. The kind that tells the truth about what drains you and what restores you. The kind that refuses to romanticize exhaustion. The kind that understands the difference between effort that builds and effort that merely preserves an image. That difference becomes critical in the later years, because there is less room to spend life on what does not matter. This is where peace becomes more than a feeling. It becomes a method of living. The person learns how to remain unshaken not by avoiding all difficulty, but by ceasing to make difficulty into a total identity event. They are not reduced to their losses. They are not defined by what has passed. They are not dependent on the old forms of success to feel worthy. They are building something quieter and more durable. A mind that knows how to stand in change without collapsing into the old story of decline. That is the real opposite of decline. Not eternal youth, but increasing freedom from illusion. Freedom from illusion is one of the most important achievements of midlife because it allows the person to see what is actually available now. A younger self often runs on inherited momentum, social expectations, ambition, comparison, and the assumption that later life will naturally reward those who keep pushing. But by 50, the body and mind begin to teach a different lesson. They ask for selectivity. They ask for discernment. They ask the person to stop pretending that every door still needs to be opened. This is not limitation in the tragic sense. It is focus, and focus is a form of liberation. When the person stops chasing every possible identity, They gain the ability to refine the one they are actually living. That refinement is where the second half of life can become deeply meaningful. A simpler home, a quieter social circle, a clearer schedule, a more honest relationship to work, a calmer relationship to the body. These are not small changes. They are the architecture of a life that can be sustained without constant strain. Buddhism offers a useful lens here because it keeps asking the same practical question in different forms. What is necessary and what is merely attached? The ego often confuses the two. It calls many things necessary because it does not want to lose them. But if a habit, relationship, ambition, or image can only be preserved through exhaustion, then perhaps it was never a necessity at all. Perhaps it was only a dependency wearing the clothing of importance. This is why simplification feels so powerful once it begins. It is not about having less for the sake of appearing virtuous. It is about freeing attention from what has become too expensive to maintain. A simpler life lets the person hear themselves again. It lowers the noise level. It makes true priorities visible. It allows energy to be redirected away from maintenance and toward meaning. That redirection changes the emotional tone of life. The person is less likely to feel perpetually behind because they are no longer chasing every standard the world offers. They begin to trust a quieter metric. Is this arrangement helping me live with greater clarity, greater steadiness, greater honesty? If the answer is yes, it deserves attention. If not, it may deserve release. This is the beginning of a more sovereign way of living. Sovereignty after 50 is rarely loud. It is usually expressed through the refusal to waste life on what no longer matters. It is the decision to leave certain pressures behind without needing to dramatize the departure. It is the willingness to say that not every obligation is sacred, not every relationship is nourishing, and not every expectation deserves your obedience. That willingness often looks small from the outside, but internally it is enormous. The reason it matters is that a person who cannot simplify cannot rebuild. Their life stays crowded with inherited demands and outdated performances. They remain loyal to roles that no longer fit. They keep trying to maintain identities that require more energy than they return. Eventually, that life becomes a kind of quiet self-betrayal. The person keeps functioning, but they are no longer truly living from the center of their own experience. Buddhism identifies this as one of the central problems of attachment. Attachment does not merely cling to objects. It clings to burdens too. It clings to familiar strain because strain can feel like identity. The person may not love what drains them, but they know how to live inside it. That familiarity can be mistaken for stability. In reality, it is just a well-practiced exhaustion. The path forward is not to force an entirely different life in a single leap. It is to begin subtracting the false load. Remove what no longer serves. Reduce what consumes without replenishing. Quiet what is too loud to hear the heart beneath it. Let certain obligations be re-examined rather than blindly preserved. Rebuild the shape of the day around the life that is actually possible now. This process is often uncomfortable because the ego prefers complexity. When complexity hides fear, a crowded life can make a person feel busy enough to avoid deeper questions. A simplified life does not allow that same evasion. It asks more directly. What truly matters now? What is still worth building? What is being carried only out of habit? Those questions are uncomfortable, but they are necessary. And once they are faced, the person often discovers that simplicity is not a loss of richness. It is the clearing away of what was preventing richness from being felt. A quieter life can actually be more alive because it is less entangled in performance. The person becomes available again to ordinary things. A calm morning, honest conversation, meaningful work, healthier rhythms, and the simple dignity of being less divided. That availability is a great reward. It is the kind of reward that does not wear out quickly because it is based on coherence rather than stimulation. Coherence is one of the hidden measures of a well-built second life. It is the sense that the different parts of existence are finally pointing in the same direction instead of constantly pulling against each other. In a coherent life, how you spend your time matches what you say matters. What you protect matches what you claim to value. What you refuse matches what weakens you. The person is no longer living in contradiction, just to keep old patterns intact. This coherence is difficult to reach if the mind is still organized around the approval of others. Approval-seeking fragments life because it forces adaptation to too many external expectations. One room wants one version of you. Another room wants another. One person's standards conflict with another's. One role demands one posture. Another role demands another. The self becomes a collection of adjustments. Eventually, it may function, but it no longer feels whole. Buddhism helps restore coherence by reducing the authority of outside judgment. The person begins to ask what is skillful, rather than what is applauded. That simple change alters everything. The life starts organizing around clarity instead of image. Decisions become easier because the standard is more stable. Does this reduce suffering or increase it? Does this support the mind or scatter it? Does this align with the life I am trying to build now? Or does it keep me tied to an older script? These questions are practical and liberating. They allow the person to make fewer decisions from guilt and more from truth. And because truth is more stable than social approval, the resulting life becomes steadier as well. Less frantic, less theatrical, more inhabitable. This is especially important when purpose is being redefined. A person after 50 does not need to chase significance in the old sense. They may no longer need to build a life around being constantly visible or admired. Instead, they can ask a different question. What kind of contribution is worthy of the wisdom I now have? That question leads to a deeper, quieter purpose. It may be teaching, mentoring, creating, caring, simplifying, or simply living in such a way that others can feel steadier in your presence. Purpose built this way does not depend on public applause. It depends on inner agreement. The person knows why they are doing what they are doing. That knowledge sustains them more reliably than external reward ever could. It also makes the life feel more integrated. The person is not splitting themselves into a public image and a private truth. They are allowing the two to align. That alignment is one of the clearest signs that rebuilding is working. The rebuilding process begins to mature when the person understands that purpose is not meant to rescue them from age. It is meant to help them inhabit age with dignity. A mature purpose does not pretend that time has stopped. It does not fight the reality of change. It works inside it. It says, in effect, this is the stage I am in, and I will meet it well. That is a profoundly Buddhist attitude because it replaces denial with presence. The person is no longer insisting that life should be different before it can be meaningful. They are asking what can be made meaningful now. That shift transforms the emotional atmosphere of aging. The later years stop being a countdown and become a field of practice. The question changes from what have I lost to what is still possible here. That question is far more powerful. At this stage, the mastery of peace becomes especially important because it protects purpose from becoming another ego project. If the person turns their second act purpose into a performance, then they simply recreate the old instability in new form. They begin to chase validation again. They become attached to how the purpose appears, rather than how it functions. Peace prevents that by keeping the purpose grounded in what is real. A peaceful life is not one without challenge. It is one in which challenge no longer automatically produces identity crisis. The person can face difficulty and remain centered enough to respond intelligently. That capacity is what makes peace a mastery rather than a mood. It is a trained condition of the mind. It comes from not feeding every disturbance, not demanding every answer immediately, and not making every change into a threat. This is why the deepest success in the second half of life is not accumulation. It is unshakability, a mind that can remain clear through change, a heart that can remain open without clinging, a life that can remain useful without constant self-display. That is a success many people overlook because it does not look triumphant, but it may be the most worthwhile form of success there is. It is the success of being able to live without being owned by the changing conditions of life. The success of not needing to chase youth, proof, or permission to feel legitimate. The success of standing where you are and saying, honestly, that this life still has meaning and that you are ready to shape it well. That is not decline. It is a quieter kind of power. A quieter kind of power often begins with a quieter relationship to regret. Midlife can bring regret with unusual force because it gives the mind room to review what has been lost, what was not done, what was delayed, and what cannot be recovered. If mishandled, regret becomes corrosive. It loops, it punishes. It keeps the person living in a tribunal of missed chances. But if understood properly, regret can become a form of pattern recognition. This is an important distinction. Buddhism does not ask the person to deny regret. It asks them to stop feeding it as a permanent identity. Regret is information. It tells you where your life has been out of alignment, where attention was misplaced, where fear was given too much authority, and where old habits led you away from what mattered. If the person can look at regret in this way, it becomes useful rather than poisonous. The silence that develops in a more mature life helps here. Silence creates room to look back without immediately turning the past into self-attack. It allows reflection without collapse. In that space, the person can see patterns more clearly. They can notice how often fear delayed action, how often comparison narrowed perception, how often approval-seeking distorted choices, how often resistance kept them from moving into a more coherent life. This clarity is painful, but it is also freeing. Once the pattern is visible, it no longer has to be repeated blindly. That is the great value of regret when it is transformed properly. It becomes a teacher of boundaries. It reveals what not to carry forward. It reveals what not to repeat. It reveals what was never worth the energy it consumed. In that sense, regret can support rebuilding, if the person is willing to let it become wisdom rather than punishment. Buddhism would say that the mind suffers when it tries to live in the unrecoverable past as though the past could still be negotiated. But the past cannot be changed. What can change is the present relationship to it. The person can use regret to become more honest and more precise. They can learn where they were divided. They can choose not to feed the same division now. That is how regret becomes part of the architecture of renewal, rather than the ruin of it. The architecture of renewal depends on being able to simplify the inner life as well as the outer one. This means removing unnecessary mental clutter. Old comparisons, old stories, old self-accusations, old fantasies of a different life, old obligations that no longer serve the future. The more this clutter is reduced, the more available the person becomes to what is actually happening. Presence grows, peace deepens, purpose stabilizes. This is not a passive process, it requires repeated choices. The person must keep deciding not to live inside every thought that appears. They must choose not to keep every old grievance on active duty. They must choose not to let every memory become an indictment. They must choose not to keep feeding outdated versions of themselves just because those versions are familiar. In this way, simplicity is not merely about the external environment. It is a disciplined inner practice. The reward is substantial. As mental clutter decreases, the life becomes more intelligible. The person can see what is essential. They can distinguish between necessary effort and unnecessary strain. They can identify which relationships are rooted in mutual growth and which are rooted only in habit or guilt. They can see which responsibilities belong to them and which were inherited without question. That seeing is liberating because it allows the life to be restructured with greater honesty. This is where the second half of life can become deeply fruitful. Once the false load is removed, the remaining life can be lived with greater intention. The person is no longer trying to preserve the image of who they used to be. They are building a coherent life from what is actually true now. That may look less dramatic, but it is much more durable, and durability matters. The later years are not best served by intensity that burns out quickly. They are best served by a steady structure of habits, values, and relationships that can hold through change. The person learns to be less reactive, less scattered, and less dependent on external validation. In that steadiness, the mind becomes capable of peace that does not need to be constantly defended. That is the mastery the work has been pointing toward all along. The mastery of peace is not an end to life's movement. It is the end of the mind's war with that movement. It is the point at which the person can say, without pretending, that this life now belongs to presence more than to performance. The mastery of peace is not the same as emotional numbness, nor is it a victory over all feeling. It is the capacity to remain upright while feeling. That may sound simple, but in practice it is one of the hardest forms of maturity to develop. Most people are trained to believe that peace depends on circumstances becoming favorable. Buddhism reverses that belief. It teaches that peace becomes possible when the mind stops demanding that circumstances behave in a way that protects the ego at midlife. This lesson becomes especially important because the person can no longer afford to build their life on unstable conditions. Youth once provided a kind of borrowed momentum. Social expectations once supplied a framework. Ambition once supplied urgency. But later, life asks for something quieter and more dependable. The person must learn how to be at ease without requiring everything around them to remain unchanged. That is not resignation. It is freedom from the need to control reality in order to feel safe. This is where the earlier work comes together. The person who has simplified their environment, reduced energy leakage, loosened attachment to image, and chosen purpose more wisely is now better able to sustain peace, because peace is no longer being interrupted by unnecessary friction. The life is less crowded. The mind is less noisy. The ego is less demanding. The heart is less divided. All of that creates the conditions in which a steadier kind of living can take root. But the real test of peace is not whether the person feels good when life is easy. It is whether the person remains clear when life is not easy. If a setback occurs, does the mind immediately collapse into old narratives of decline? If regret appears, does it become a prison or a lesson? If the body slows, does that become humiliation or wisdom? If the world does not confirm the old identity, does the self panic or adapt? These are the questions that reveal whether peace has become mastery. A mind trained in Buddhist understanding does not demand that life be frozen in order to remain at rest. It sees that impermanence is not the enemy. It sees that change is not a punishment. It sees that the self was never meant to be preserved in one fixed shape forever. That recognition gives the person a strange but powerful strength, the ability to stay steady while everything continues to move. And this is the quiet success the essay has been pointing toward from the beginning. Not success as accumulation, but success as unshakability. A mind that does not need every circumstance to validate it. A life that is no longer at war with age. A self that has stopped trying to haunt its former shape and has begun to inhabit the present one fully. That is the real reconstruction. Reconstruction after 50 is not about pretending the earlier chapters did not happen. It is about refusing to let them become a prison. The past has value when it teaches. It becomes a burden when it is used as a standard that the present must somehow imitate. This is one of the deepest causes of suffering in later life. The mind keeps comparing current reality to an earlier version of itself, and then declaring the present deficient. But the present is not deficient, simply because it is different. That difference is where maturity lives. The body now asks for more respect and less abuse. The mind asks for more silence and less noise. The schedule asks for fewer fragments and more coherence. The relationships ask for more honesty and less performance. The spirit asks for a life that fits the truth of who has been shaped by time, rather than who once existed in memory. Rebuilding only begins when these new demands are heard clearly. Buddhism makes this possible by weakening the ego's claim that identity must remain fixed. The person is not required to keep being the same person in order to remain worthy. In fact, much suffering disappears when they stop trying to do that. They do not need to resurrect the old image. They need to become real in the present. That is a much humbler task, but also a much more fruitful one. The more honestly the person sees what life now requires, the less energy they waste on fantasy. They are no longer trying to compete with the past. They are responding to the current conditions. That responsiveness is a form of intelligence. It means the person can adapt without humiliation and change without self-contempt. They can allow the earlier life to have been meaningful without insisting it must be repeated. This is where the second act begins to feel like its own distinct creation, rather than a failed extension of the first. It is not a diminished replay. It is a new arrangement of values. Depth becomes more important than display. Rhythm becomes more important than excitement. Clarity becomes more important than image. Peace becomes more important than proving a point. The life begins to simplify around these new priorities. That simplification is not a loss of richness. It is the removal of distortion. Once distortion is gone, what remains can actually be appreciated. And that appreciation is one of the quiet pleasures of maturity. Appreciation becomes deeper when it is no longer mixed with desperation. A person in the earlier stages of life often clings because they are afraid of losing what feels precious. But clinging makes even good things hard to enjoy. It introduces anxiety into beauty. It turns gratitude into fear of future absence. In later life, when the mind begins to release its dependence on permanence, appreciation can become cleaner. This cleaner appreciation is one of the gifts of peace. The person can value the day without demanding that it last forever. They can value their body without pretending it will remain unchanged. They can value their relationships without demanding that they freeze in a preferred form. They can value their work without needing it to certify their worth. This is a profound shift because it lets life be experienced directly rather than defended constantly. The same is true of purpose. Purpose no longer has to be theatrical to matter. It can be quiet, useful, and deeply rooted. The person may mentor, create, support, simplify, or contribute in ways that are not widely celebrated. But if the purpose is aligned, it carries weight. It becomes a source of coherence rather than ambition. It helps the person organize their remaining years around what actually matters, not around what used to matter. This is where mastery becomes visible in action. A person at peace does not need to force meaning into every situation. They can allow meaning to emerge from disciplined engagement with what is in front of them. They are less likely to chase novelty for the sake of feeling alive. Instead, they learn that aliveness often comes from depth, from attention, repetition, honesty, and the ability to remain present without distraction. Buddhism would say that this kind of life has more freedom because it is less entangled. The person is not split between the image they present and the truth they live. They are not forever negotiating with age, trying to hide it or reverse it. They are living with it, and that changes the emotional climate of existence. A life lived in truth may be quieter, but it is also steadier and more usable. The final task, then, is not to defeat age or outrun decline. It is to see through the illusion that your worth was ever dependent on youth in the first place. Once that illusion falls away, the person can live more fully in the years that remain, not as an apology, not as a struggle to preserve what is gone, but as a deliberate, coherent, and peace-centered way of being. The illusion of decline loses power when the mind stops asking age to do a job it was never meant to do. Age was never meant to preserve identity. It was never meant to keep the body unchanged. It was never meant to guarantee social relevance or eternal momentum. Those were the fantasies the ego attached to life. When the fantasies collapse, the person may feel as if something essential has been taken away. But what has been taken away is only the demand that life remain a mirror of youth. That demand is what causes so much of the unnecessary suffering in midlife. The person sees change and interprets it as erasure. They see less speed and interpret it as failure. They see a quieter social world and interpret it as irrelevance. They see a body that asks for more care and interpret it as decline. But none of these things are inherently tragic. They are only tragic if the person continues clinging to an identity that can no longer be maintained without suffering. Buddhism invites a different view. It says that the pain of age comes mostly from refusing impermanence. The body changes, roles change, attention changes, relationships change, energy changes. None of that is a mistake. The mistake is demanding that the present should still behave like the past. Once that demand is relaxed, the person can begin to live in the truth of this stage rather than in resistance to it. That is why the later years can become so meaningful. They are not inferior to youth. They are different in what they call forth. They ask for wisdom instead of speed, discernment instead of display, coherence instead of performance, and peace instead of constant proof. If the person responds well, the result is not less life but more exact life, less waste, less noise, more truth. This is the final reversal. The years do not have to feel like a shrinking if the person stops measuring them by what is gone. They can feel like a concentration of what remains. And what remains, if cultivated with care, can be rich indeed. Presence, clarity, purpose, simplicity, compassion, steadiness, and the quiet dignity of a mind that no longer needs to win against time. That is the real mastery of peace, not defeating age, but no longer mistaking age for defeat. Not restoring the past, but inhabiting the present so fully that the past no longer defines the value of what is here, and that is enough. The mastery of peace becomes real when the person stops treating change as an interruption and starts recognizing it as the very medium of life. This is one of the deepest lessons of the later years. Nothing has failed simply because it has moved. The mind may want stillness because stillness feels safe, but existence is not built on stillness. It is built on movement, and the person who can remain centered inside movement has found something sturdier than control. At 50 and beyond, peace no longer comes from trying to hold the world in place. It comes from letting the world be what it is without turning every fluctuation into a threat. This is a subtle shift, but it changes the texture of the day. Delays are less offensive. Losses are less personal. Silence from others is less destabilizing. The body's needs are less humiliating. Time no longer feels like an enemy to be outrun, but a condition to be inhabited wisely. That transformation is possible only when the person has already done the harder work of releasing the old image. The self built around youth, speed, and public relevance was never going to survive intact. The question was never whether it would change, but whether the person would fight that change or learn from it. Buddhistic wisdom keeps pointing back to this choice. Clinging makes age unbearable. Acceptance makes age usable. Acceptance does not mean liking everything. It means refusing to argue with what is true. What is true is that your remaining energy matters more than ever now. What is true is that attention is finite. What is true is that peace cannot be borrowed from approval or status. What is true is that simplicity is not deprivation but protection. What is true is that purpose, if chosen wisely, can deepen rather than diminish with age. These truths become more obvious when the noise gets quieter. The person who has learned to live this way begins to see that the final years need not be a retreat into invisibility. They can be a distillation. Less performance, more presence. Less striving, more discernment. Less comparison, more steadiness. Less attachment to former roles, more faithfulness to what remains real. That is not the story of decline. It is the story of refinement. And refinement, in the end, is a kind of victory. Not the loud victory of conquest, but the quiet victory of no longer wasting life, resisting what could have been met with grace. Refinement is what happens when the person stops trying to be everywhere at once and begins to invest deeply in what is still alive. By this stage, the question is no longer how to expand endlessly. The question is how to live well within the shape that life now has. That may mean fewer commitments, but more meaningful ones. Fewer possessions, but more order. Fewer social performances, but more honest relationships. Fewer ambitions rooted in image, but more work rooted in conviction. This shift is often misunderstood because people assume that a smaller life must be a lesser one. But Buddhism would say that life becomes richer when what is unnecessary is removed. A cluttered life often feels full because it is crowded, not because it is meaningful. Once excess falls away, the quality of what remains becomes visible. A simple meal can be more satisfying than a complicated one. A quiet conversation can carry more truth than a room full of noise. A purposeful hour can matter more than a frantic day. This principle applies to the interior life as well. When the mind stops filling itself with comparisons, fears, and imagined obligations, space opens. In that space, peace is not forced. It can appear naturally because nothing is constantly covering it. The person begins to recognize that many of the old pressures were self-generated, and that much of what was called necessity was really just habit. This is where a mature life becomes more exact. The person knows better what they can carry, what they can release, and what they should no longer pretend is theirs to fix. They no longer need to prove their value by taking on too much. They no longer need to preserve every role. They no longer need to keep up with younger versions of themselves. That freedom from false duty is deeply relieving. At the same time, the person becomes more capable of genuine contribution because they are no longer divided by the effort to maintain appearances. What they offer now is less performative and more authentic. It comes from experience, steadiness, and a clearer relationship to reality that makes it more useful even if it is less flashy. This is the hidden truth of the second half of life. What looks like less from the outside may actually be more from the inside. Less noise, more depth. Less ambition, more wisdom. Less competition, more presence. Less holding on, more clarity. That is how the second half becomes not a reduction but a refinement. The mastery of peace depends on this refinement, Because peace cannot live long in a crowded, reactive mind, it requires a certain simplicity of arrangement. Not perfection, but coherence. The person has to know what they are no longer willing to feed. Comparison, for example, must lose its authority. So must ego's need for applause. So must the habit of asking permission before moving in one's own life. So must the tendency to turn every change into evidence of decline. Peace is built by refusing to keep these habits on active duty. This refusal is not aggressive, it is disciplined. The person does not wage war on every thought. They simply stop giving certain thoughts the right to govern. That is a profound difference. A thought can arise, and yet the person does not have to become it. A regret can appear, and yet the person does not have to live in it. A fear can surface, and yet the person does not have to obey it. The mind learns to observe without being seized. This kind of inner freedom is what makes aging less painful. The body may be slower, but the mind is less dragged around. The life may be quieter, but the quiet is no longer a sign of absence. It is a sign of power that does not need display. The person is no longer chasing the world for proof that they matter. They know how to matter by living with clarity. This clarity is not abstract. It shows up in practical ways. The schedule becomes cleaner. The environment becomes simpler. The people around you are chosen more carefully. The commitments you keep are more aligned. The way you spend mornings changes. The way you handle money changes. The way you respond to disappointment changes. These are not superficial modifications. They are signs that the center has shifted. When the center shifts, peace becomes less fragile. It no longer needs ideal conditions. It can survive on honesty. That is what makes it mastery. A person who is at peace only when life is easy is not yet free. A person who can remain steady in difficulty has learned something real. This is why Buddhism keeps emphasizing the same principle in different forms. Do not cling to what changes. Do not make your peace dependent on what cannot stay. Do not ask your worth to be certified by the world's approval. Each time this is remembered, suffering loosens its grip a little more. And once it loosens enough, the person begins to live not as someone declining, but as someone refining what it means to be fully alive now. To be fully alive now is to stop trying to live in the shadow of an earlier self. The person at 50 no longer has the same body, the same energy, the same social leverage, or the same assumptions as before. But those losses are only losses if the mind insists on measuring life against a chapter that has already ended. If the comparison is released, the present can finally be seen on its own terms. That seeing is transformative. It allows the person to recognize that wisdom often arrives precisely where speed once dominated. The life may no longer reward constant acceleration, but it can reward depth, patience, and discernment. It may no longer be useful to chase every opportunity, but it becomes increasingly important to choose well. In other words, the later years ask for judgment, not just effort. Buddhism supports this shift because it is less concerned with accumulation than with clarity. The point is not to gather more identity, more status, more stimulation, or more proof. The point is to reduce suffering and increase awareness. When the person understands this, many of the old anxieties lose their force. They no longer need to become louder to remain meaningful. They can become quieter and in many ways more effective. A quiet life, then, is not a diminished one. It is a life with less interference. The person can hear themselves more clearly. They can sense what is truly important. They can recognize when something is only a habit and when it is genuinely worth preserving. This ability becomes invaluable because midlife tends to expose what was sustainable and what was merely exciting. The real test is not whether the person can still do everything they once did. It is whether they can live wisely with what actually remains. That requires honesty. It requires letting the past have had its place without forcing it into the present. It requires appreciating what has changed without making that change into a catastrophe. It requires trusting that a new form of life can still be meaningful, even if it is not a replica of the old one. This trust is one of the hallmarks of mastery. The person no longer panics at the loss of previous patterns. They can stand in the present and build from it. They can let the old self go without contempt and allow the new self to emerge without drama. That is a deeply mature kind of strength. It is the strength of someone who has learned that meaning does not disappear when form changes. It deepens when the person stops resisting reality. Meaning deepens when reality is no longer treated as an enemy. This is perhaps the greatest reversal in the later years. The person stops trying to force life to preserve their preferred image and begins to see how much energy had been lost in that struggle. It is a quiet liberation. No grand announcement is necessary. The relief is visible in the way the person no longer needs to fight every change, as if change itself were insult. This is where the mastery of peace becomes visible in relationships as well. When the mind is no longer constantly searching for approval or reassurance, relationships become less burdened by hidden demands. The person can love without using others as proof of self-worth. They can listen without needing to dominate. They can be present without constantly seeking to be seen. That is a more honest form of connection, and often a deeper one. It also changes the way the person handles solitude. Solitude is no longer experienced as abandonment. It becomes space. Space to think clearly. Space to rest. Space to notice where energy is going. Space to reconnect with what matters without the interference of social performance. In that sense, solitude is not the absence of life. It is a condition that makes life more legible. The same is true of regret. In a less reactive mind, regret can be studied rather than worshipped. It can reveal patterns without becoming a prison. It can show where the old self was overattached, overdriven, or misled by fear. That knowledge can guide the present if the person is willing to use it. But if regret is allowed to become identity, it will simply continue the old suffering under a new name. Buddhism keeps returning to this point because it knows the mind's tendency to cling even to pain. The mind can become attached to its own wounds because wounds offer a familiar story. But a mature life refuses to let pain become the final definition. It uses pain as information. It uses loss as instruction. It uses age as refinement. And this is why the later years can be so powerful. They offer fewer distractions from truth. They ask the person to see more clearly what has been built, what has been wasted, what has been learned, and what is still worth carrying. If the person answers well, the result is not decline, but a quieter and more resilient kind of flourishing. That flourishing does not need to advertise itself. It is enough that it is real. What is real in the second half of life is often less dramatic than what the ego hoped for, but more satisfying than what the ego used to chase. A calmer morning, a clearer mind, a more deliberate schedule, a smaller set of commitments held more faithfully, a body treated with more respect, a purpose chosen with more honesty, a social world shaped less by obligation and more by genuine resonance. These things may seem modest, but they are what make the later years livable and meaningful. The ego often hates this kind of simplicity because it cannot turn it into a spectacle. It prefers growth that can be measured publicly, success that can be displayed, and change that can be narrated as a triumph. But the deepest transformations rarely look like that. They look like fewer but better habits, less chaos, more discernment, less drama, more steadiness, less need to be validated, more willingness to be truthful. Buddhism would say that peace is not found by winning an argument with time. It is found by ceasing to demand that time remain a certain way. The body ages. The world shifts. The social landscape changes. The person who insists on freezing these things will only suffer more. The person who learns to meet them with clarity can remain alive to what is still here. And what is still here is often enough. Enough breath, enough capacity, enough presence, enough wisdom, enough opportunity to contribute, to love, to simplify, to serve, to create, to rest, to notice. The mind no longer needs to live as if all value were behind it. It can discover that value is not only in accumulation, it is also in the quality of attention, the honesty of purpose, the steadiness of peace. That is the final lesson of this reconstruction. A life after 50 does not need to be a lesser life. It can be a more exact life, less attached to image, less governed by comparison, less dependent on permission, less burdened by unnecessary noise, more aligned with truth, more respectful of energy, more capable of peace. And peace, once understood this way, is not a fragile mood. It is the most durable success available to a human life. Peace becomes durable when it is no longer treated as a reward for ideal conditions. That is the turning point. Until then, the mind keeps waiting for the world to settle before it allows itself to soften. But the world does not settle, not for long. Conditions change too quickly. People remain inconsistent. and the body continues its own quiet revision. If peace depends on all of that being perfectly arranged, then peace will always be temporary. The wiser path is to build it where change cannot easily destroy it, in attention, in discipline, in truth, and in the refusal to keep arguing with reality. This is why the later years can become far more peaceful than the earlier ones. Even if they are less energetic in the old sense, the person stops using life to prove something and starts using life to understand something. That shift removes a great deal of internal pressure. There is less need to impress, less need to outrun time, less need to maintain a story that no longer fits. The life becomes easier to inhabit because it is finally being arranged around what is real rather than around what is hoped for. Buddhism would say this is the point at which suffering begins to lose its fuel. The mind is no longer feeding the illusion that things should have remained as they were. It is no longer trying to clutch at youth, status, social visibility, or a fixed identity. It is learning to meet what is present without constantly comparing it to what used to be. That is not a small adjustment. It is the difference between living in resistance and living in contact. This contact produces a quieter confidence. The person knows they do not need to win against age in order to remain meaningful. They do not need to become younger in order to remain valuable. They do not need to preserve every old role to remain whole. Meaning has moved inward. It now comes from coherence, from honesty, from wise action, from a life shaped by attention rather than by panic. That is why peace matters so much in the reconstruction of the second half of life. It is not a decorative mood. It is the foundation that allows the rest of the life to settle into place. Without peace, every change feels like collapse. With peace, change becomes workable. Without peace, the person keeps reaching backward. With peace, the person can stand where they are and build. That is the real mastery. Not a life without movement, but a mind that no longer needs movement to become frightened. A mind that is no longer frightened by movement becomes capable of a deeper kind of freedom. It can adjust without humiliation. It can simplify without feeling diminished. It can let go without converting release into defeat. This freedom is subtle, but it changes the entire emotional structure of life. The person no longer wakes up fighting the fact that they are older, quieter, or less externally driven than before. They wake up with the opportunity to live well inside the shape that time has given them. That opportunity is precious because it restores agency where the ego had created dependency. The ego says, you are only enough if you still look, move, and matter the way you once did. Buddhism says, your worth was never dependent on that performance to begin with. The person who begins to trust this understanding can stop wasting energy on impossible restoration. They can put that energy into living with greater precision. Precision is one of the overlooked gifts of maturity. It means knowing where your attention should go and where it should not. It means being able to tell the difference between a real responsibility and a habit of overfunctioning. It means recognizing which relationships deepen the life and which ones merely preserve old patterns. It means discerning the difference between effort that builds and effort that only exhausts. That discernment is invaluable because it protects the person from spending the second half of life on the wrong things. This is also where the idea of purpose becomes more refined. Purpose is no longer primarily about proving potential. It is about using what has been learned. That can be a far more generous and stabilizing aim. The person may no longer be chasing the highest level of achievement, but they can still be deeply useful. In many cases, they become more useful because they are less attached to image and more available to truth. And truth is what makes purpose sustainable. A purpose built on fantasy burns out. A purpose built on approval becomes anxious. A purpose built on wisdom holds. It allows the person to participate in life without having to dominate it. That is the kind of purpose that fits the later years. Grounded, restrained, and quietly strong. This strength does not require constant explanation. It is visible in how the person lives, not in how much they talk about living. They become less interested in being perceived as transformed and more interested in actually becoming transformed. That distinction matters because the second half of life has little patience for theater. It asks for substance, and substance is built through repeated, humble acts of attention, discipline, and release. Repeated release is one of the most important disciplines of maturity. The person must keep letting go of what the mind wants to keep resurrecting. Old identities, old ambitions, old comparisons, old resentments, old regret loops, old fantasies of how life should have been. These things often return because they are familiar, not because they are true. The mature person learns not to confuse recurrence with necessity. Buddhism is especially clear on this point. The mind tends to cling even to what causes suffering, if that suffering has become part of its identity. A person may still tell the story of who they were, what they lost, what they failed to become, and what they should have done differently. But if the story is repeated without insight, it becomes a cage. The only useful purpose of looking back is to see more clearly what should not be repeated. That is why regret, when used wisely, can help shape the future. It can show where the self was divided. It can expose where fear was given too much authority. It can reveal which habits silently cost the most. But regret must be converted into pattern recognition, not self-punishment. Otherwise, it simply becomes another form of attachment, another way of keeping the mind stuck in what cannot be changed. Letting go, then, is not one dramatic event. It is a repeated practice. Every time the old story rises, the person notices it and releases it again. Every time comparison tries to define the day, the person refuses to let it govern the heart. Every time the ego asks for old forms of validation, the person returns to quieter sources of meaning. Every time the mind wants to make age into a verdict, the person returns to truth. This repeated release makes room for a new relationship to life. The person is less burdened by what was and more available to what is. That availability is what allows peace to deepen. It is also what allows purpose to stay alive without becoming rigid. A person who can release repeatedly is a person who can continue growing without needing to be a younger version of themselves. This is the hidden genius of maturity. It replaces dramatic reinvention with steady unbinding. The life becomes lighter, not because it is empty, but because it is no longer overloaded with unnecessary attachments. And once the attachments thin, the essential can be felt again. That is when the second half of life stops looking like decline and starts looking like clarity. Clarity is what remains when the mind stops arguing with the shape of reality. At that point, the person no longer needs to pretend that aging is a flaw, that quiet is weakness, or that reduced speed means reduced worth. Those are only the old measurements of a self that was taught to value performance above presence. Once those measurements lose authority, the person can begin to live by a different standard. The new standard is not intensity, it is honesty. It is the ability to tell the truth about what now sustains you and what now drains you. It is the willingness to simplify what has become too heavy. It is the refusal to keep pretending that every old role still fits. It is the courage to accept a quieter life without interpreting it as a smaller one. In that honesty, the person finds a deeper kind of strength. Buddhism would say that this is freedom from illusion. The illusion was never that life changes. The illusion was that your value depended on preventing that change from altering your image. When that illusion falls away, the person is no longer at war with the present. They can inhabit it, they can shape it, they can allow it to be enough. This is where the earlier themes finally converge. The resistance has been seen. The ego has been loosened. The old identity has been released. Discipline has become structural. Simplicity has made room for truth. Purpose has been chosen more wisely. Peace has been protected from the demand to prove itself. What remains is a life that can breathe. That breathing life is not dramatic, but it is real. It does not need to be loud to be meaningful. It does not need to be young to be valuable. It does not need to be publicly recognized to be complete. It only needs to be lived with attention, with care, and with the willingness to keep returning to what matters. That is the final answer to decline. Not denial, not nostalgia, but a disciplined and peaceful presence that knows how to meet the years without fear. And this is the real end of the story the ego told. The story said that life after 50 was a narrowing, a fading, a retreat from significance. But the deeper truth is that what narrows is mostly illusion, and what fades is mostly performance. What becomes possible instead is a life with less noise and more meaning, less dependence and more steadiness, less comparison and more direct contact with what is real. that life is not inferior, it is distilled. It has been pressed by time into something more exact. The body may ask more of you now, but the soul may finally be able to ask for less chaos. The mind may no longer move with youthful speed, but it can move with greater discernment. The social world may no longer reward you in the same way, but you may no longer need its reward to feel legitimate. These are not defeats. They are signs that the center of gravity has shifted from image to truth. The mastery of peace is the ability to stand inside that shift without panic, to see that the old self was never meant to remain untouched, to understand that the later self is not a fallen version of the earlier one, but a different expression of the same life under different conditions, to accept that the task is not to recover the past, but to inhabit the present so fully that the past no longer controls the value of the moment. In that sense, the second half of life is not about decline at all. It is about refinement into a truer form of being. What is superficial falls away. What is unnecessary is released. What is false is seen more quickly. What is real becomes more valuable. Peace becomes less of a luxury and more of a way of living. Purpose becomes quieter but more stable, and the self, no longer forced to haunt its former shape, begins at last to live where it is. That is enough. The final test of this path is not whether the person can explain their transformation, but whether they can live without needing to explain it. That may be the clearest sign that the work has truly taken root. The ego loves commentary. It wants to narrate progress, defend its choices, and present every change as evidence of a personal victory. But the deeper life does not require that. It can remain quiet because it is no longer trying to convince anyone, including itself. This is where the illusion of decline breaks completely. Decline was never just about the body slowing down, or the world paying less attention. It was about the mind insisting that those things should not happen. Once that insistence falls away, the person sees the years differently. Time is no longer an enemy. It becomes a condition through which wisdom, simplicity, and steadiness can emerge. The life that remains is not less valuable because it is older. It is often more valuable because it has been refined by reality. A person who has arrived here no longer needs to compare the present with a former peak. The old peak was one expression of life, not the measure of life itself. The current chapter may be quieter, but it can also be more truthful. It may have fewer outward markers of power, but it can hold more inward freedom. It may not look glamorous, but it may be far less divided. That kind of unity is difficult to see from the outside and impossible to fake for long. What remains is the practical art of staying centered, not permanently, not perfectly, but repeatedly, returning to what matters, refusing what drains, letting go of what no longer fits, protecting attention, honoring the body, simplifying the schedule, choosing purpose without needing applause, living without asking age to apologize for itself. These are not small habits. They are the structure of a peaceful second half. And if there is any wisdom to carry forward from this entire reflection, it is this. The years do not take meaning away unless the mind gives them that power. When the mind stops resisting impermanence, aging can become a site of refinement rather than humiliation. When the ego loosens its grip, peace becomes possible without conditions. When the person stops trying to resurrect the past, the present finally becomes livable. That is not decline, that is arrival. Arrival is not a destination in the usual sense. It is the point at which the mind stops insisting that life must become something else before it can be worthy of respect. That may sound simple, but it is one of the hardest realizations to accept because the ego is always trying to postpone peace. It says peace will come when the body improves, when the finances stabilize, when the relationships settle, when the world becomes kinder, when the old identity can still be defended. Buddhism exposes this delay as another form of suffering. Peace does not arrive by waiting for conditions to become perfect. It arrives when the mind stops demanding perfection as the price of peace. This is the final turning point in the reconstruction after 50. The person no longer asks life to reverse itself. They no longer treat age as an accusation. They no longer interpret quiet as disappearance. They no longer confuse slowness with failure. They no longer measure their value by the speed with which they can reproduce an earlier version of themselves. What they want now is simpler and more demanding at the same time. To live truthfully in the chapter that is actually here. That truthfulness creates a kind of inner spaciousness. The person can feel the weight of what has changed without making that weight into despair. They can acknowledge regret without making it into identity. They can notice the limits of the body without turning those limits into shame. They can accept that some doors are closed while remaining open to the ones still available. In that spaciousness, a new dignity appears. Not the dignity of triumph, but the dignity of alignment. The path has been moving toward this all along. Resistance weakens. Ego quiets. Simplicity clears the field. Discipline gives shape to the day. Purpose becomes more exact. Peace becomes less dependent on conditions. And finally, the person sees that the second half of life is not asking for a rescue from time. It is asking for a deeper relation to time. One in which every day is no longer a referendum on what has been lost, but a place where what remains can finally be lived well. That is enough for a human life. Perhaps more than enough. The essay ends where the struggle ends, not in victory over time, but in the refusal to let time define the soul. That is the last freedom available in this reconstruction, and perhaps the most important one. The body will continue to change. The world will continue to shift. Roles will continue to fall away and new responsibilities will appear. None of this can be prevented, and none of it needs to be feared as long as the mind no longer mistakes change for defeat. What remains, then, is presence. Not the dazzling presence of youth trying to be noticed, but the settled presence of a life that has stopped arguing with reality. The person has learned to live without begging to be restored to an earlier version of themselves. They have learned that value is not erased by age, only revealed in different form. They have learned that peace is not a reward for perfect conditions, but a skill of meeting what is here without panic. This is why the later years can be the most honest and, in some ways, the most beautiful. The unnecessary has been tested by time and found wanting. The fragile has been exposed. The superficial has lost its shine. What remains can be seen more clearly. Attention, discipline, simplicity, purpose, gratitude, and the quiet strength of a mind that no longer needs to perform in order to be real. That is a different kind of life from the one that came before, but not a lesser one. It is more distilled, more exact, and often more free. The ego may object to this because it still wants the old story of ascent. But the wise mind knows that ascent was never the only possible shape of a meaningful life. There is also deepening. There is also refinement. There is also the slow and dignified stripping away of illusion until what remains is enough. The second half of life becomes powerful precisely when it stops trying to mimic the first half and begins to honor its own form. In the end, there is no need to win against age. There is only the need to stop losing yourself to fear of age. When that fear dissolves, the years cease to feel like a sentence. They become a field of practice, a place to live honestly, and a chance to meet existence with greater clarity than before. That is the quiet triumph Buddhism points to. Not escape from time, but freedom within it.